Thank you to all the presenters. If you have any questions, again, type your questions in the Q&A, and you can use a chat as well. And if you would like to ask your question in person, please feel free to raise your hand. I see we have one hand raised. And so generally we've had 3 presentations, one from the director C1, who's shown us the correlation on the, between climate change and conflict, particularly in for communities on the ground. And it was particularly interesting to see the graph that he presented showing the correlation between climate variability and conflict. And I think someone mentioned in the chat about the commitment of IGAD to peace and security and addressing climate change. And IGAD has been having conflict, addressing conflict as one of the key pillars since its inception in 1986. In fact, most of the African Union peacekeeping forces in both Somalia and South Sudan are from IGAD member states. And the presentation from Dr. Florian on the peace process, which is a new conversation that we're beginning to have in the region, looking at how then we can bring in the climate issue into the peace process, because so far we've had, we have a lot going on in different spaces. The climate field with IGPAC, IGAD has invested a lot in understanding the climate. And as Director C1 rightly said, there's a lot of data also in understanding conflict in the ground. And Dr. Crump brought in the aspect of how then we can begin to introduce the peace and security, climate issues into the peace and security space. And particularly we were saying moving from using the terminology conflict multipliers into climate related security risks. So there's, this is an interesting conversation for the region. This is an interesting approach for the region. And finally, we had from Malvin, who comes in with a possible solution in terms of providing African insurance to the nations. And I will probably bring him back in later on to give a comment on, because I noticed that none of the Eastern African regions seem to be included in any of the schemes. And then also when we talk about vulnerable population, I think there's a very, very interesting slide that Dr. Crump showed about how conflict and places that are fragile states are experiencing security, peace and security issues seem to have also climate issues. So that's an interesting, I guess it's not really a linkage, correlation, or to look at both issues in terms of places that are fragile and experiencing conflict and seem to be also be the same areas that are experiencing climate risks. And then if we're looking at insurance as a solution, it seems like the condition to receive insurance seems to be you have to be have a pre-approved contingency plan, which some of the fragile states and some of the post-conflict states do not really qualify. So it'd be interesting to hear from you, Melvin, later on how then do we address these issues for countries that do not have the institutional structure to qualify for this insurance. So I would like to direct the first question to Kamlas, since we haven't heard from you in a while. There's a point that you raised on vegetation increasing conflict, and there's been a question from Fari Marumbwa for you to expand on that. How does vegetation increase conflict? And while you answer that, I will allow also Mr. Mongoma, who's the CEC Agriculture for Taita Taveta, to give his question. So Kamlas, go ahead. If you're still here, can you expand on how does increase in vegetation result then in increase in conflict? Because I think the understanding has always been, well, if there's vegetation, then problem solved. Hello, Kamlas, we can't hear you. While he's unmuting himself, Mr. Mongoma, you can go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask your question. I see your hand is raised.
Sorry?
You can go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, actually, I've been on and off internet here in the hotel. So at one point, I had to be using my bundles, the mobile phone to follow. But I hope I can be heard. I'm just trying to say that the nexus between all these presentations is becoming very clear. And I was just reflecting on what I heard from Africa Risk Capacity. And so when we say that climate change doesn't need to be lead to these serious vulnerabilities and conflicts, and we're already seeing a solution. And I was, of course, going to ask Melvin the same question that Linda, you've asked, which is whether, I put it another way, I was wondering whether our pastoral areas, the communities there actually are aware of this and what really can be done so that they can be able to benefit from this. Because for me, this is one of the solutions that, if taken early enough, can tremendously reduce conflicts in this region, because basically people are ready to increase the stock. If you can assure them that you will be able to restock later, it would be okay. Now, in the question of, no, and one thing I wanted to put on Florian presentation was about including or mainstreaming climate issues within the peace agreements. And of course, I think it's very easy at the local level, where actually all the local intercommunal peace agreements that I mentioned earlier, actually climate information is actually the central thing, and perhaps something that those higher level peace agreements. Now, the question on the vegetation, I think, is straightforward, and I tried to respond to it earlier in my presentation. And I said just basically two things. Is that actually normally raids would take place when communities know that they can be able to sustain the animals, the livestock. So it means then that when the vegetation and of course the grass and the rest increase, then of course they know they are able to sustain their livestock, and that means they need to get more. And in the process of going to get more livestock, then violence takes place. The other reason is that raids or rust take advantage of. So you can easily raid livestock and go through the forest with the vegetation and move through. But when there is drought and the vegetation cover is not there, basically you will be able to be seeing the raided livestock from a far distance. So that is actually a deterrent if there is drought. So that's what I was saying, it's counterproductive or intuitive in the sense that you want to have rain so that you have enough grass and you have vegetation for the browsers and the like. But then you're also saying that, but it also has a risk component. And so when you're designing early response, this is something that we also need to take into care. It's not just now we have rain, therefore things are going to go normal. No, anticipate that there's going to be raids and violence associated with it. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much. Mr. Mongoma, you can go ahead and unmute your mic if you want to ask your question. So I think we can give Dr. Crump a few minutes to also comment on some of what has been said. How then do we begin to introduce the climate issues into those high-level peace agreements? And also, I think when we talk about, when we begin to look at the long-term climate risks that again are going to impact countries across regions, we're beginning to see issues of water, like what's happening in Ethiopia and Egypt. And we also have different borders that where what happens in one country in terms of natural resources, water in particular, impacts another country. So looking forward in terms of agreements between countries, how then, given your research and given the context, not just in the fragile states, can we begin to, in a practical way, include climate indicators?
Yeah. I think that's a difficult question, but it's a really important question. I think the key question is about sensitizing people that are not. Everybody here in the seminar is probably aware of or interested in the climate link. But a lot of people we interview when we did the study for Somalia, or when we do the study now currently on Mali, and quite frankly across the board, is once you get to the a lot of responses, especially among actors that are especially focused on hard, real security issues, right? Climate change is often not considered a real security issue. But I think the response you get is I don't do climate. But once you talk to them, and first they're reluctant to talk about it because, well, we don't do climate. But then once you speak to them, you're like, well, actually, yeah, there seems to be links. And that was one of the intentions with the study we did on UNSOM, was to really show across the board of the mandate, which has very hard security issues with security sector reform, where you get exactly this response: we don't do climate security, or we don't do climate, where you all of a sudden see like a bulb going up and like, yeah, wait, there is something, right? It is not the factor, it is not the most important factor, but this is a really important factor that needs to be taken into account. The way we do that when we, for example, do trainings is let the experts fill out the blanks. I don't need to explain the experts in a specific region the dynamics, peace and security dynamics of the region, right? It would be, I don't think it would be right for me to trying to explain you the Horn of Africa. But maybe giving some ideas and giving the thoughts on how climate change is impacting various forms of insecurity, how it is impacting human security, how it is affecting livelihoods, and how to think about some of these connections that we often don't do because we're still separated in silos and think about specific areas. I think is a key pathway that allows people very quickly to make these connections. And I think we see that here very clearly, right? With sort of the connection between CVERN and ICPAC, where, I mean, there is a natural synergy that is necessary and important to get to. The question is, how do we get those people then a place in the high-level peace agreement negotiations? But I think without going into a discussion of Ethiopia and the Nile, Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, and the Nile issue, we see that climate change is starting to emerge as an issue. We probably need significant learning, and quite frankly, probably we need to do a few mistakes along the way, how we get there. But I think it is slowly, more surely sinking in. We have a lot of requests from mediation experts to like think about climate security and conduct trainings. So I think there is a hunger and an interest to do that. But then, quite frankly, we didn't do that often, right? So we will have to learn how this really plays out in reality. What works, what doesn't work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crump. I think that also seems to be the challenge in this space, because in terms of acknowledging that there is a link that has been done. With the African Union, they did release a statement talking about human security and how climate change may result in human rights abuses and intra and interstate conflicts and wars. The UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, for the first time in its strategic plan this year between 20 and 22, is taking climate change as critical considerations in its overarching agenda. So we're beginning to see that the recognition of climate as a human security risk, and this human security risk, then the possibility of it impacting the peace agreements that are being made right now and disrupting it has been recognized. But I think, as you rightly mentioned, the process of finding the solution then needs to begin. And I think the director Siwan mentioned it, the need for research and the availability of data now, then to begin to bridge that gap and come to a better understanding. I think there's more work being done by IGAD in terms of community level work, but now to begin to then bring the climate issues into the high level peace agreement discussions is one that we need to begin to look at. And so next I'll bring Malvin back, because we have a number of questions for you. And you can begin by talking about Eastern Africa, and what do you think are the reasons why none of the countries are insured? And then what is the solution for the fragile states that are most impacted by climate change, the ones that are in the process of state formation and don't yet have institutional structures? So then how can they benefit from this such insurance schemes? And then the question that Kalmas asked, and also one of the has been asked from the floor, do you then ensure that the insurance that is taken by the countries, how do you ensure that it reaches the last mile user? And then maybe you can highlight and give your experience. I think you gave a slide on how some of the concepts that you use to provide insurance, or some of the key indicators that you use to provide insurance for countries, can then translate to giving community insurance to the ground. And I think there's a comment that has also been stated that a number of pastoralists are not taking insurance because they don't see the need, or they don't see the use. So how then do you then also convince the people most impacted on the need for insurance? So I'll let you answer those for now.
Thanks, Linda. So there's quite a few questions. There's one question which I will ask my colleague Farai to respond to in terms of the satellite, with the link between the satellite so imagery and insurance products. But I'll make a start on the other one. So I just maybe look at, so it's important to look at insurance as part of an ecosystem. I think if you look at insurance as just one item, you kind of lose quite a lot of the main issues. And why I say that is because fundamentally what we're talking about disaster risk management. We are talking about the potential loss of lives and livelihoods, the displacement of people, all the negative socioeconomic sort of ills that's associated with climate change. So I think that's well documented. But I think it's important just to sort of go up a little bit higher to say, okay, what are we really talking about? So firstly, I think then that the one thing that's really important to note is that the disaster risk management sort of frameworks on the continent are less advanced. They're still in early stages. So if you compare maybe countries like the UK, the US, I know they've got more money, but in essence, what's in place is that the countries have well-defined disaster risk management and financing frameworks. So they already go through a regular process where they assess their exposure to drought, floods, or all these other sort of perils. So that really enables them to then say, okay, with what we know about our exposure to these particular perils and how much we could be liable to pay as a government to protect our citizens, what financial instruments do we need to bring to bear to be able to respond in the event of such of such a disaster occurring? So that's really, I think that's really important. And the reality is, on the continent, this is still an evolving conversation. We are making progress, but this is an evolving conversation. And then that leads into the sort of the awareness of insurance and the barriers that lead to the lack of adoption of insurance. So I don't know if you're aware of the stats, but on the continent we roughly have about for the entire continent less than 2% adoption of insurance. So that basically means that less than 2%. If you look at the insured risks versus the potential risk, there's only 2% of those risks that are insured. So this is not just a government issue. This also goes down to our own attitudes around our perception of insurance and our use of insurance. So if we then overlay, if you then transport that into the government discussion, if you think that as an individual, if you bring up, if you just think about or reflect on some of your feelings to insurance, and then you bring that into sort of the public space and the government space, then it's quite clear that you see that insurance as a disaster risk financing tool suffers from quite a number of issues. Number one, if you compare that, so the fact of the matter is with insurance, there is no guarantee of a payout, right? You don't get insurance and pray, you don't get insurance for your car and pray for an accident. But you kind of see not a similar approach, but then that the viewpoint that, well, I've put money in insurance policy in the year that I've insured myself, there's been no payout, so why should I continue? So it really, and I'm making the link between insurance and the wider disaster risk management framework. So that is still evolving, and across the continent, it's an area that we are actively engaged in. It's one that goes just beyond ARC. It's the likes of IGAD, the likes of ICPAC, NGOs, multilaterals, the political masters themselves, or even at an AU level. I believe that it's imperative for the leaders to actually come up with minimum standards on disaster risk management and financing that countries should adopt. And once we get to that particular point, it will be much easier to then develop these various systems that respond in the event of a disaster. So then coming on to East Africa, I think that, so first of all, the first thing to say is that the participation is actually, is voluntary, so countries are not forced to be part of the, of ARC. Countries actually come to ARC and specify that, this is their particular interest, and, so obviously part of our role is to engage with countries to sort of bring them onto the table. But I wouldn't want to single out East Africa and say, oh, there's a particular problem there. I think across the continent, there's so many countries where we've engaged with them for over 5 years, and then finally managed to get them in. So there are a number of obstacles that prevent countries from joining. So amongst them is a political will. It's around the acceptance of insurance as a sovereign disaster risk management tool. It's around the funding. A lot of the countries have competing needs, and for a Minister of Finance or Agriculture to stand up in Parliament and say, I want to spend $500,000 USD on insurance policy, it can be difficult. So there's quite a, and this is why I always emphasize that we need insurance exists as part of a framework. So, and the reality is that most of those frameworks are still not in place. And then in terms of the fragile states, I also want to mention that we work with what we call replica partners. So these are NGOs that can also purchase an insurance policy for the benefit of a specific country. So so if there are drought conditions that exist, then that replica partner. So just for information, the replica partners we've had so far are World Food Program, which I'm sure everyone knows, and Start Network. Start Network is a sort of a conglomeration of various UK NGOs. So what these institutions can do is they can buy insurance policies that which when they trigger, the WFP and Start can then implement the response in those countries. So this is something that we're looking to do in those fragile states where, because in the past, as you mentioned, our mechanism relies on a functional state machinery, and to the extent that it's not there, which it wouldn't be based on the presentations that we've seen. So that's something that we are trying to we're trying to look at. And I think to be perfectly honest, I think this is such a big problem that we need all the sort of brain power from a variety of sources, right? And we welcome, and part of this engagement is also good to sort of get ideas on how we can make this mechanism better. And in terms of the payouts, I did try and answer in the chat, but just to emphasize that when a country gets a payout, there is an operational audit, and an operational audit just to make sure that the response activities were carried out in the way that was specified in the contingency plan, and that there's a financial audit to make sure that the funds were utilized, for the activities. So this basically makes it, there's accountability in the implementation of the payout, and also each country that gets a payout also has to present a report at the Conference of the Parties, which is the supreme governing body of ARC. So and if a country defaults or does not comply with the rules, then the ultimate sanction is the country is expelled from the mechanism. So politically, there is quite a lot at stake for countries to make sure that they comply with the rules. Linda, if you maybe could guide me if I've left out anything, I will try and address them whilst I've got the mic. But yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're almost coming towards the end. I think Farai was to explain about the NDVI and the index that you use when it comes to monitoring through satellite information. Go ahead.
Well, yes, thanks very much, Linda. So for the operational monitoring of vegetation, we mainly use the MODIS NDVI, and this data set is, commonly used, for operational, vegetation monitoring conditions across the world. For example, even the ICPAC, they make use of that data set. So I think that's the primary source of monitoring. So it's available on a 1 kilometer resolution. But just to add, like the system that we use, the risk view software, it also comes with the MSG NDVI dataset, which is available at 3 kilometer resolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we wind up, I'll give each of the panelists a chance to say something in closing, and starting with Kamlas. And before you say something, if you could comment on, I think one of your slides you showed when you're talking about Turkana, the inadvertent, the conflict between wildlife and human beings that would eventually happen when human beings encroach into the protected areas as when they're looking for pasture. So there's a number of comments on the human-wildlife conflict, and I don't know if C1 has any experience with that. And then before you also close, I'd like if you could maybe talk about the experience that C1 has in terms of creating peace agreements at the community level and at between the different classes where you work at the hotspots. And if there are any lessons that C1 has learned from that can then be translated as we begin to look at the climate issue in the high-level peace conversations. So if there are any lessons that you've learned at that level that you can give that can then be translated to the high-level engagement between communities, that would be very helpful. So Kamlas?
Thank you, Linda. Those were many questions for a closing statement. Yeah, in terms of human-wildlife conflicts, of course, this is a phenomenon that is also on the rise, and it's actually being experienced in many parts or many countries of the IGAD region. And we haven't been able really to, I think this is part of the areas that we need to focus a bit of our indicators to assess this. But yes, we do know from information that we gather, not necessarily using the indicators that we have, of this kind of conflicts happening. And in my presentation, I'd mentioned about the issues of the boundaries. And those boundaries are not just between, say, pastoral groups, but it also, there's also a slide that I showed there that shows the protected areas. So some of these protected areas are either forests, or there are wildlife conservation areas, etc. But what we see, of course, is when there is drought, most pastoral communities would basically go. So long as there's anything green that can support the lives of animals, they will move. And that, of course, creates a lot of conflicts. Some of us may recall there was, in Laikipia, there was a huge conflict there that led to even the death of some ranchers there. And the whole issue was that the pastoral communities decided they saw a green areas, and their livestock were dying of drought. What did they do? They moved in. So those kind of conflicts, of course, they happen, and they are also part of the wider conversation that need to be done. But it's also the other way around, where, for example, the wildlife also get out of their parks or the conserved areas. If the drought, for example, is hitting hard in the conservancies or whatever, they move outside. So this is also an interaction, and it's a good point that can also form a basis of conversation. In terms of the peace agreements, yeah, I'd actually asked if there are any lessons that we could also take. But yeah, I think basically it could be different. It could be different because sometimes what is being discussed at those higher levels is seen to be a bit removed from the kind of the day-to-day intercommunal interactions. That is not to say that the decisions that are made at this higher level peace processes don't have impact on the ground, because at the end of the day, even the troops themselves that are negotiating the peace, they operate from the ground, they operate from somewhere else. As they move also, there are also distractions that are taking place. They zone out areas, they limit movements of even the local communities from using the areas that they normally would use before. And but centrally to this is that climate is a concern to these communities for the sake of the livestock, and also crop for the agriculturalists or agro-pastoralists. And so whenever they're starting to craft these agreements, that of course becomes the main starting point. And they know that they need each other. Yeah, they would need each other in the future. So it's better actually to come up with those agreements that would then safeguard the relationship that they will be having in the future, either when there is a rain or when there is a drought. It's also very interesting, and I think this is a point of probably further conversation on how the issues of climate can be integrated in this higher level conversation, but it's a very interesting point. In just concluding, I think I wouldn't have much to say, just to reiterate what I said in the conclusion, that yes, there is a very strong correlation between climate change and conflict. But in between the two, we have things that can be done, because the climate change affects the ecosystem that supports the livelihood of the communities. And our point of entry should be ensuring that we protect this ecosystem so that it's able to support the livelihoods, or provide for these communities other complementary or supplementary sources of livelihood as they go through this. And it is something that can be done. I think and I said there, we have experienced with it, and I believe there are also other good experiences out there, that if you use climate information early enough, couple that with the proper, I think we should not be expecting so much of distractions or loss of lives that would arise as a result of climate change. I think I would end there, and I thank you for giving us this opportunity to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much. There's a lot of valuable information that's been added in the chat. If you're not looking through the chat, there's a lot of resources that have been shared by, I think Florian has shared some, but there are also attendees that have shared quite useful information. So feel free to take some of that. The videos from this discussion will also be available on YouTube later on this week. And we will share a summary of the presentations also later on this week. And then also we'd like to request, if we have a poll, please feel free to answer the questions on the poll so that we can, to help us improve our future webinars. So my next, I'll invite Florian to give his closing remarks, and particularly also if you can touch a little on the gender and the youth, involvement of gender and youth. I think you talked about it a little on the chat, the gender aspect, but there's a question on the involvement of youth as well in the process. So if you could do that, and then give us your closing remarks.
No, thank you, and thank you to the questions and the answers of the panelists. I think we could go on probably another couple of hours with the discussion. I think the question of gender is absolutely critical and important, as was rightly pointed out in the process. Women are an important part of peace processes, and their inclusion and meaningful participation is a fundamental issue that needs to be raised. Aside from the dynamics we point out in the Somalia report, which I would recommend you to look into if you have an interest, I think there are important things to also consider, right? It is not just women being exposed to climate change, also of course herders or being pushed into different areas are facing the exposure of extreme temperatures and are actually also susceptible to sexual and gender-based violence. So the dynamic I think that I want to highlight is what we see in a lot of cases is because of displacement and pressures, we see a feminization of villages, right? The only ones left often are women and youth. And that has a fundamental effect on their roles in society and oftentimes has an empowering effect. So we should also look at that in an interesting, positive way. So, but that is something that needs to be nurtured and taken up in a different way. And let's be honest, the international community does not capitalize on that opportunity specifically, right? So it sort of, we see that in some examples, in Mali, for example, where we see sort of a trend of empowerment over a couple of years because of conflict and climate pressures, but then after the intervention, we're actually transitioning back to old gender roles, right? And it raises the question: what are we really doing? Shouldn't we kind of capitalize on the opportunity that arises because of some of these actually disruptive events? So I think that is absolutely a fundamental thing to raise and especially also study further and highlight these dynamics. I know UN Environment in a joint project with UNDP and UN Women is working very careful on that. There are great examples on South Sudan. I'm not sure I can find them in time, but if you Google them, you find them, I'm sure. In closing, I think I wrote down 3 words: coordination, flexibility, and uncertainty. And I think there's we need to have an honesty and an humbleness about all of this. There's absolutely a need to coordinate better, to bring different actors together, facilitate coordination on the same level. Different actors, different organizations have mutual learning of what works, what doesn't work. But a lot of times we need a high degree of flexibility and to respond. And I think that would be sort of the call for the donor community, right? There's a high dependency often on funds, on external funds, which are sadly often earmarked to very specific, very concrete projects, leaving actors on the ground that actually need a lot of flexibility to respond once we see different things, to react different and independently. The uncertainty element is simply also the reality. We can, while we can start to acknowledge, especially on the local level, as was rightly pointed out, the climate dimension in peace agreements, what we are not doing is accounting for the uncertainty that comes with climate change, right? We can predict a lot of things, but if we look at the models, we also know that, well, we don't really know a lot of things, right? It can go either way. And how do we make and how do we build these systems, not just peace agreements, but more broadly, in a flexible way that accounts for this uncertainty is, I think, the real challenge. Which leads sort of to the point of what is actually success? When do we actually know that when we do what we do, how do we know it has a success? If you think about climate security and the places we see the work from USAID colleagues that overlay climate change exposure and fragility, we see this high degree, which also was brought up by Mr. Mogo. But what does that really mean? That also means if we address climate issues successfully, actually, there's still conflict. Hopefully to a lesser degree, but there's still dynamics going on and disruptive events which are putting holes in our development and progress that we're trying to make. I think that is a really fundamental and important question we should think about. And the last point, data is absolutely fundamental. To have data that is solid and to have a data literacy of people beyond the early warning systems and the climate prediction centers, but to have a data literacy of people that understand, well, you know, this is actually bad data. Some of the claims put out, numbers put out, do they really, you know, what do they mean? And to have this data literacy come in. I think that is fundamental, and data in itself is, however, not the solution, right? We see that, and that as a last final mention, we see in the Nile issue, it's politics. Data is not solving this, right? We have the data, but what happens if we can't agree on the data? What happens if we don't want to accept the data? We need to, and that is the link back to the high-level peace agreements. We need to acknowledge, and I think in cases like the Nile, we see that like nowhere else, water and climate issues are not technical problems in itself. They're highly political issues. And if we treat them as highly political issues, we make a first step towards desecuritizing them, making them a part of the political discussion, not of a security discussion, but we are also avoiding to just treat them as purely technical elements. I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. I think you bring to light a lot of very important points. And this indeed is the beginning of a discussion on how then as a region do we begin to bring into the political discussion some of the areas that not experiencing mitigation or adaptation because the issues are more politically related than they are technical. To Malvin, I'll give you a few minutes to give your closing. I think we've asked you a lot of questions, so you can just go ahead and give your closing.
Thank you so much, Linda. So I think my final thoughts on this is that, this, as we've heard, this is a multidimensional, problem or issue. If you look at some of the charts, I was just kind of scrolling through issues of questions around gender, youth, the wildlife-human conflicts, adaptation, mitigation from a climate perspective, geopolitics. So yes, it's a multidimensional issue, but I think that, as Florian mentioned, we can, and I'm sure also that the first speaker also mentioned, sorry, I just forgot his name. I was trying to, so he also mentioned that, we mustn't get stuck into this sort of paralysis, because there are still things that we can do within our own institutions. And I think by starting this conversation, that should really spur us to sort of say, okay, what do we want to achieve? What, if we have this call, if we have another call in the next 6 to 12 months, what can we say we've done on the back of this call? So I think that we should really have tangible follow-up steps. And from my perspective, I'm really, like I said, I'm really offering, the ARC machinery to interested countries, and we rely on IGAD and ICPAC to really collaborate and sort of spread out the message, because the more people that we have really whispering or trying to influence, I think the better. So that's really, my final thought is really a call to action for all the people who are on this call, so that we can at least reflect on 6 months from now or 12 months from now and say, after that call, this is what we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this brings us to the end of this webinar. It's been an interesting discussion, and I'm sure we could go on and on for a long time. So please feel free to give us a feedback on what you thought about the webinar, answer the poll, and we hopefully will begin to have another discussion with the political actors and begin to pick their thoughts on what they think the way forward should be. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Director Siwan. Thank you, Dr. Crump. Thank you, Malvin, for your contributions. And hopefully we will continue working together from here. So thank you everyone, and have a good afternoon.